Hello, hi everybody. Welcome to King's Head Live skills session on Thursday, the 16th of April. King's Head are running these sessions every weekday during lockdown at 1 p.m. On Instagram and on Facebook. If you're on Instagram at the moment, I would be very grateful if you could switch to Facebook, because I need to do a screen share later on, and that doesn't work on Instagram. So Instagram people, change to Facebook. My name's Rebecca Pitt. I design theatre posters. I'm going to be talking about what makes a good theatre, what makes a good poster, how to work with designer, and I'm also going to sort of talk through a case study of the design process. Just to start off with, just later on this week, actually next week. So tomorrow we've got John Britton, who wrote Rotterdam. He's going to be talking about The Pillowman by Martin McDonagh. Next week we've got the theatre company Hive North, writer and director Ricky Beadle-Blair, improv expert Pippa Evans, and writer Tristan Finn Adjoinu. So make sure you tune into all of those tomorrow and next week. So I'm going to be talking, assuming a lot of you are probably producers, but if you have any questions about things from a different point of view, or just generally questions in general, please type them in. I'm not quite sure where I see, I see where I see the comments. Okay, give me a little message if you have a question and I will do my best to answer it. Okay, so I just want to start by talking about what makes a good poster. I think I'd start by saying that I don't believe there are any particularly hard and fast rules. I think sometimes when you follow rules, you can end up with something a bit boring, but there are sort of guidelines or ways of at least approaching the process that I've kind of worked out over the last 10 years or so of my career. So just as a basic start, a poster's job is to be the visual identity of the show, and it should capture its spirit, and it should just make you want to find out more, really. It doesn't really need to do much more than that, because your hope is that someone sees the poster, and then they go and Google it, and then they read the website content, they look at the other content you've got, and then that takes over from there and hopefully persuades them to buy tickets. But yes, it is also your sort of visual identity for people who haven't yet seen the show, so it's very important. There's a very good book that I've got called On Broadway by Drew Hodges, who is from Spotco in New York, and he writes about the theatre design process. And he starts each project with thinking about the event and the non-event. And I like that way of thinking about it. I didn't call it that before I read the book, but now I do. So the event is what's exciting about the show, why people would want to go and see it. Basically, your unique selling point, as they call it in the advertising industry. So, for example, maybe it's a politically relevant, quirky comedy. Maybe it's a dark, sort of thought-provoking, intelligent thriller. Maybe it's the definitive stage adaptation of a book that everybody loves. Maybe it's a new take on a classic, or a sort of beautifully poetic piece with stunning visuals and physical theatre and things. The event is not the same as the themes or the story. The themes that are important to a director or a writer are not necessarily important to people who haven't yet seen the show. So it's really important to think mostly about what's going to appeal to people that haven't seen it yet or haven't read it and don't know how great it is. The non-event, this might sound quite negative and cynical, but I think people probably are quite cynical when they're booking theatre tickets. I think I am, because you're giving away an evening of your life, you're spending money on the tickets and on your travel. I think I sometimes, when I'm thinking of booking for a theatre show, I do sort of think, what if it's going to be boring? Boring is the main thing that you want to avoid. But essentially the non-event is what would put people off the show, or what's not exciting about it. So, for example, it might be boring. Maybe it's dated a bit. I've already seen 10 productions of Midsummer Night's Dream. Why do I need to see another one? Those sort of things are the non-event. And as I said, it sounds negative, but I think it's important to think about those things, because then you have to sort of try and combat that in the poster. So for example, if you were doing a Sarah Kane play, I guess the non-event might be that it might just be a bit bleak and depressing. So in the poster, maybe you want something that's a bit sort of punchy and possibly comic, depending on your interpretation of the play, that just kind of lightens that a bit and reassures people that it's not going to be the non-event that they might have worried about. If you're doing a Joe Orton comedy, for example, people might think, oh, but it's a bit old and dated. I've seen it before. Maybe in the poster image, you want to think about something that shows that it's a sort of fresh new take, perhaps, or that it shows how it might still be relevant. So all of those, once you've thought about all those things, you've got to think about what the image is going to be, essentially. It's difficult to say where the ideas for that come from. It's usually from the script. Sometimes there's a moment in the script that where you think, that is cool, I've got to put that on the poster. Sometimes there's a metaphor where you think, oh, that really sort of sums up the spirit of the show. Sometimes the main selling point, the event, is that there's a famous person in it, and then maybe you want to put them on it, or the playwright is the main thing, in which case maybe the typography is the main thing with the writer's name and that sort of thing. So once I've thought about what the image is going to be, the next thing is sort of how to execute that. So I guess you've got illustration, you've got photography, you've got a mixture of the two. You've also got the typography to think about. There aren't really any rules for this, I don't think. I think you've just got to think about what's right for the play. It's always nice if if it sort of fits in with if the visuals fit in with the way that the play is going to be executed in the end. For example, I don't know if you saw the poster for Company. I didn't do it, but the West End production of Company last year, it had this sort of gel lighting from the sides in the poster, and that was the lighting scheme for the play as well, and it just all fitted together. It just gave you a good feeling for the show. So, and I suppose with typography, sometimes you think, well, it's set in the 1920s, so maybe I'll use a 1920s font. But also, equally, maybe you want to go against that if you're worried that people might think it's old-fashioned. If you're doing a sort of period piece, maybe you want to go for some really contemporary typography. So that's sort of how I approach how to make a good poster. I'm going to look at some questions, which I can't work out how to get the questions on Facebook, I don't think, but I don't think there are any questions yet, but if anybody has them, please type them into Facebook. If I'm doing this wrong and I've missed them, please could somebody let me know. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was how to work with a designer. I'm sort of talking here, I guess, to producers. And sorry, no questions yet, that's fine. Save them all up till later. So I'm talking to producers here. So the first thing you want to do is obviously you want to choose a designer whose work you like and who you trust. That might sound obvious, but that will obviously help the process. If you like their work, then you're gonna like you're going to like working with them, you'd hope anyway. When you send someone a brief, the main thing to send them is the script, a soundtrack if it's a musical. If it's sort of a physical thing or a dance thing, then it's great if you've got any videos or anything like that from any research and development showings. That all you're trying to do really is give someone the sort of the vibe of the show. But really, I find as a designer, I need to read the script, because there are often sort of moments in the script or little metaphors that you might not be able to get across without having actually read it. So yes, send them those things. If you've got any ideas about the design of the show itself, the look and feel of the show, maybe your set designer has put together a Pinterest board or something like that, then that is good to share with the designer as well, because the more it can feel like it belongs to the actual show, the better, I think. Very boringly, you also need to send the designer any information, the text, the logos, things that need to go on the poster. And you need to find out if the theatre has any brand guidelines. For example, the Park Theatre, Southwark Playhouse, the Arcola. There are a couple of others that have quite strict brand guidelines that the designer needs to know that right from the start, because that's going to affect, usually it means that you can't do your own title treatment, and therefore you need to think differently about how you approach the whole thing. So when you work with a designer, it's the designer's job to come up with ideas, really. So if you've got an idea of your own, it's fine to tell the designer that idea, but I would just sort of make sure that they don't feel constrained by that, because an idea that sounds like it's a good idea in your head might not actually work in practice. And yeah, you've just got to talk about the ideas and be open to new ideas, I think. I've got a question here from Chris, who says, how do you approach designing a poster for a show you've previously designed? For example, the same pantos every year, which happens to me quite a bit, actually. With pantos, it's really hard. And I do kind of struggle with, I think I did 5 Cinderellas last year. I have to just try and find what's unique about that show. I guess that goes back to the event. Why would I see this version of Cinderella when I've already seen 4 other Cinderellas? You know, maybe this one is, maybe it's a sort of Victorian music hall feel, or maybe it's a circus version or something like that. You know, you really want to get that uniqueness across. There are some shows that I've designed lots of posters for example, Midsummer Night's Dream. I've done quite a few. I've done lots of sort of period drama things several times. And because they're often interpreted in such different ways, you just have to focus on what makes that unique, and try and get that across in the image. So I hope that answered your question. The next thing I wanted to talk about was feedback, and so how you work with the designer once they've sent you their initial ideas. Sending off your initial ideas to a client can be quite scary. I tend to sort of mull it over for a while, and then I just click send and it's gone. But it is quite, it's not, what's really not helpful is if you get a lot of negative response, because it just kills the creative process, and that designer probably won't work with you again. I'm lucky, I've sort of curated my client list. Everyone I work with is pretty good at giving feedback. And I guess the most important thing, I have a friend he was a theatre director, Dave Owler, and he once said to me that he has this technique called yes and. So instead of answering no to things, you should always say yes and. So for example, rather than saying, oh, I don't like the title treatment, I don't like the image, and I don't like the colours, you find something you do like. So you say, you know, I quite like the font, you know, I like that, yes, and maybe we could make it more colourful, or maybe we could make it simpler. So in that way, you're sort of enabling the creative process rather than cutting it off. Sometimes I find that people, you can be too specific in your feedback. I think a lot of people think that they are more visual people than they are sometimes, so you sometimes get some odd feedback from people, and sometimes you think, oh, okay, well, I'll do it, but it won't look very good, and that's sort of a waste of time and money. What's best in terms of giving feedback, you know, unless you are the sort of person that really sort of knows what's going to look good, in which case the designer will probably have already told you that, and you'll have a good way of working together. You should try and say what you're trying to achieve rather than giving really specific feedback. So for example, if you were to say, please could you make the title stripy, the designer might try that and it looks awful. But instead you could say what you're trying to achieve, how do we make the title look more fun? And the designer might then suggest another way of doing that. You know, maybe stripy would work, but maybe it wouldn't. Talking about what you're trying to achieve rather than the specifics. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, I'm going to share my screen with you. If you are on Instagram, now is a good time to change to Facebook, because I believe I can't do, I'm worried I can't do screen share at all now. Hang on, give me a second, sorry. Sorry. No, a screen share is not enabled, unfortunately. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post the images on this instead. Sorry, give me a second. In the meantime, I have a question from Charlie Dupre, who has said, do you think it's important to have a person or a character on a poster? I think this is actually quite a common misconception. I sometimes hear people saying that their marketing person told them that a poster needs a person on it, and I just don't really think that's true at all. I definitely don't think it's a hard and fast rule. It depends on the show, it really does. And I think if that's what's going to, if you know, if it's a cast member that you think is going to be the main selling point, then that's fine. But sometimes I think you find things where you need a human element. For example, if you're doing a poster for Arcadia and your poster so far is looking quite, maybe it's looking quite sort of architectural and mathematical, then you need to think about the non-event being, is this going to be a bit like boring and mathsy? Maybe then you need to introduce a human or a tortoise element to the poster. But I don't think it's a rule. I mean, I think some marketing people say people are more likely to notice a poster with a face on. I think people are just more likely to notice a poster that looks awesome. And also, if you think when you're going down an escalator on the tube, when going down the tube escalators, there are so many posters with quite generic faces on that are usually for tiredness medicine or well woman pills and that sort of thing. I think we're kind of tired of seeing just general faces. So unless it's really sort of right for that, then right for your show, then I don't think it's a rule that you have to. I have another question from Alexandra. She said, what's your approach for when creating a new design for a production of a well-known story, say a movie that has been turned into a musical? I'm actually going to address that now with my design process for Amelie the musical. So thanks for asking that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and add an image. I don't know how to do it. Hang on. Sorry, give me a second. I don't know how to do this. Sorry, there doesn't seem to be a way of sharing my screen with you. What I'm going to try and do is do it on my phone. I can't do that, sorry. Okay, I think I'm going to have to just not do this bit. Sorry. Okay, so what I was going to talk about was Amelie the musical. I don't know who has seen, and I'll post, oh, thanks, Nick Rutter. Facebook doesn't let you post images, unfortunately. So I'll have to post those later. So for Amelie the musical, the event was that it was sort of the definitive adaptation of a film that everybody loves. And everybody does love Amelie, and it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, it's got so many visual things to it already. For me, I think the non-event was that nobody really knows it's a new musical. People might not know the music yet, and I guess there's just this feeling maybe it's going to be a bit sort of small and obscure. It was on at the Watermill, which is actually a very well-renowned venue. But if you don't know the world of musical theatre, you might think it's on in Newbury first, before it tours. Is it going to be a bit small and obscure? So my main concern for Amelie was to make it feel like the production of Amelie. So I'm going to see if on Instagram I can change to. Oh, I can't do it, sorry. Maybe I can do it on Instagram. Okay, maybe change back to Instagram, guys. I've got it on my screen share now. So for Amelie, obviously I wanted to stick with the green and the red color scheme that is so crucial to the film, just because people recognize it and it makes it feel, I just really wanted that really strong connection to the film. Usually I start with typography. So here I've started with playing around with fonts, as you can see at the top. I kind of liked the idea for Amelie that the title would be a bit like a smile. So that's why I sort of tipped it up in that direction. You see quite a lot of titles that go the other way, but it just felt sort of friendly and positive to have it like a smile. I also sort of wanted to get across this feeling that she's this really sort of unique, tiny, unique individual, sort of quite separate from a big world. And, you know, Paris is, people love Paris, right? I mean, so yeah, she's this sort of small person. That's why I had this idea of sitting her on top of the title, because I sort of liked the idea. I like the idea that she's kind of separate from it all and looking down on it all, just because that's how it feels in the play. So what we ended up doing is we went with the design on the left, which is but with a slightly chunkier version of the title. And this was the design that we used. It's actually me in the photos. My dad took the pictures in his back garden with some clothes that I got from the internet. So for now, it was a bit of a placeholder, but we used that for the initial announcement. I'm just going to check, so I think I've got some. Alex from the King's Head has said we're going to add the images to the blog post afterwards. So thank you, Alex. So for anybody watching on Instagram, these are, so we had a photo shoot. The next thing we did was we decided to photograph the actress, which you don't necessarily need to do. I don't think it's necessarily important to have, as I was just saying, I don't think you have to have the actor on the poster, especially if they're not hugely famous. And this actress, Audrey Brisson, is well known in the musical theatre world, but she's not sort of a big famous person, I suppose. But the reason we wanted to have her on the poster really was that she just really looks the part, and I think it really helped to get across it's the Amelie, you know, is going to be what you, if you love the film, then you will love this. This is what you're going to expect. So we did this photo shoot, and the photographer was Michael Worley, who's a photographer I work with a lot, and he did a great job. As you can see, he had to sort of set up a floating bench in the middle of his studio and a kind of prop for the hand to get everything in exactly the right place so that she could be realistically sitting on the title. You might notice that she had a haircut after in post-production. Unfortunately, she was in another show at the time and she wasn't allowed to cut her hair. So we ended up having to do that afterwards, which was quite difficult. We also changed the umbrella because the one for the photo shoot we thought looked a little bit cheap. So I ordered a really posh one and used that one instead. So I guess the moral of that story is try and get things right for the photo shoot if you can, but you know, if you can't, then there's always Photoshop. So that was the main image that we ran for through most of the campaign. Later on in the campaign, we had a new set of images. I was sent the model box of the set design, which was by Madeline Gerling. And the model box itself, I love model boxes. They're just like a tiny miniature version of what the set's going to be like. I haven't got a picture of it because I promised her I wouldn't share it with anybody, but it is just the cutest thing. It's sort of, it's based on it's a Paris metro station, but there's a lot of sort of wooden detail and kind of cornicing. You can kind of see it in the right-hand picture there. And it's, I just think it helps to get that sort of retro Parisian feel. So anyway, I recreated the set in Photoshop and put it in the background because we didn't have production shots yet. So that's the ones on the left. And we just to mix things up a bit, we used a different shot from the photo shoot. I think you don't necessarily need more than one poster. You can just stick with the one. But for this one, it was quite a long running campaign. I guess if you're posting the same images again and again online, especially, it maybe gets a bit boring. So this was really just to mix it up and give people a bit more insight into the world of the show. The one on the right-hand side is what we used as a sort of foresheet, a big poster outside the theatres nearer the time after the initial production on the Watermill had been on, the reviews came through. I don't always think this is a good idea. The reason we did it for this is because the reviews were so good. with just across the board really good reviews. I sometimes think that people put too many reviews and stars on posters. Maybe you might think we've done that here. I think that when I don't like it, it's when they're not from particularly reputable sources. Not reputable, that's mean, but if they're from a national newspaper, then stick it on. But I think a lot of reviews from not so big sources can start looking maybe a little bit sort of desperate. But for this one, we went with it because it's all from the Guardian and the Times and things. So the idea of using the production shot, it looks a bit busy. I mean, I prefer the original poster really, but this was really just to show people what the show looks like and to show them how spectacular it was, and also to show them the musicians, which is a very sort of signature thing for the Watermill Theatre. But if you don't know the Watermill's work, then you might not know that they use actual musicians, which is quite appealing, I think. So the final thing is, this is the programme for the show, which is based on all of the visuals. What I like to do with the programme is try and carry across the design and the typography, but try and sort of mix it up a bit. So I've used different backgrounds and that sort of thing, use the production shots. I've also, if you know Amelie, you'll know that she finds strips of photographs under the photo booth in the station. So that was my idea for sort of housing the rehearsal shots and things. So I'm going to go away from my screen now and back to some questions. So I've got a couple of questions to answer here. I've got Ali Wright, who is a wonderful photographer. Ali Wright says, what's useful for photographers to be thinking about during the photo shoots to help designers? So there's a couple of really boring things. For example, don't crop things off. We need to be able to use this image in landscape as well as portrait. So if you end up taking a really close-up shot, then that's going to be quite difficult to extend out to the side. So shoot kind of wide. In general, though, it's just really important for the photographer and the designer to talk before the shoot. If that doesn't happen, then it's really difficult to get it looking right. I find I know a little bit about photography, but not really enough to sort of tell a photographer what to do. So what I usually say to a photographer is, I'm trying to achieve this feeling, of maybe evening light or something like that. And then the photographer will say to me, well, I think I'll do this using these lights and this sort of setup. And it's just really important to have that conversation before you start, and so you know what you're doing. The other thing is, it's quite important to try and stick to the brief. I think sometimes what happens is, if there's the producers and maybe the director in the room as well, sometimes things can go off course a bit. I had a shoot recently, I won't name the show, but it was with a really good photographer. And he did a great job, but he was kind of given last minute different instructions by the director. And we ended up with only one usable shot from the shoot. Luckily, we only needed one shot, so it was fine. But there was about sort of 100 shots that just weren't what we had discussed using, and we just didn't. It was sort of a bit of a waste of an opportunity to really try and nail it. Although having said that, he did nail it with that one shot, so we were fine. But that can be a bit scary when you get a photo shoot and you think, oh no, this isn't what we discussed, because there's been someone else in the room that's sort of derailing it maybe. Alex Jackson has asked, can you tell us what you would expect to receive as a producer at the end of the design process? Posters, leaflets, title art, design elements. So that's a good question. And I think it varies from designer to designer as well. So the main thing is you get the concept signed off first. And then after that, you want to be sending your designer a list of the things you need. So it's different for each show. Usually it's a poster and various different poster sizes, all your outdoor formats, your leaflet, your web images, social media images, all that sort of thing. The bit where it becomes complicated is with layered artwork. So the normal way that this works is that there is a sort of release fee, I think it's called, for a designer to send layered artwork over. I don't actually do that because it feels like just some extra faff, to be honest. But and also I don't mind sharing my artwork because I've got a lot of time, so I'm not necessarily losing business. I've got a lot of work, sorry, so I'm not losing business by having somebody else do the artworking. But if you want somebody else to, say you've got your own in-house art worker who's going to make the various web images and that sort of thing, if you want the designer to send you the layered artwork, you need to agree that with them at the start of the process and probably expect that there would be an extra fee for that. You can ask the designer for anything you want, the type, whatever formats that you want, but you just need to sort of specify what you want from the designer as and when you go. Do I have any other questions? Sorry, I just want to check on the Instagram if I do. Oscar French has asked what makes for a good brief from producers' marketing departments. So sometimes I find that briefs are actually, people sort of write up these really complicated briefs that aren't really that useful. It's good to know, you've just got to discuss the selling points, the event and the non-event, and include as much information about the show, the script and things as possible. I think when a brief is too specific, it can be a bit restricting. I think it's just as good for a brief to be done over the phone, to be honest. Obviously, you've got to send someone the text that needs to go on there, but I quite like to be able to ask questions. It's not as formulaic as maybe some people would expect. It's not a sort of list of things. I'd like to be able to ask the producer questions about, to what extent are we selling this as a comedy, or, how important do you think this is? And that's a discussion rather than a brief on a Word document, I suppose. So, I mean, the best briefs that I get are the best scripts, basically. That's what makes a good brief, is a really nice script. I'm going to see what other questions we've got. So Alex Jackson has asked, what do you think about having lots of information on a poster, reviews, awards, taglines, etc.? So I personally, I think, keep it as simple as possible. It's always important to remember that the poster is for the audience members. It is not for the team. So I think you've got to try and kind of put vanity aside and don't list every single member of the creative team on the front of the poster. If it's a selling point, that this famous director is involved, then by all means put it on. But I don't think you need, I think really the title, the author, the theatre and the dates. I mean, personally, I don't even think you need a website because people will Google it, but I think people would disagree with that. In terms of reviews and things, I think I covered that with Amelie. I think it can be clutter, but if you've got really, really good reviews from some big newspapers, then great. What the other review? Oh, taglines. I think a tagline can be useful if once you've got especially with new writing, I think, if you sort of don't quite know what it is, you look at the image you've got on the title and you sort of think it needs a bit of clarification. I don't particularly like taglines that are like a fantastic new exciting musical or something, because I think, well, I could have worked that out myself. I think a tagline, if it's written like it comes from within the world of the script, is great. And if that sort of intrigues you a bit more, then that's great. I have a question from Matt Smith, who says, do you have a favourite design or poster you've worked on, or one that you're most proud of? I've got quite a few. Amelie is one of my favourites. I really liked Fishbowl from last year's Edinburgh Fringe. I like Annabella Ema, which I did for At Assist Theatre Company last year. I quite like things where, I quite like doing still life things. Annabella Ema was like a little tiny bird inside a animal's jaw, which I made using part of a fox jaw and also a mould of my own teeth that I had from when I got my mouth guard made. I quite like things that are a bit challenging and difficult to make like that, just because it's fun and it's a challenge. Nick Rutter has asked, as overall fashions come and go, do you predict an increase in illustrated posters? That is an interesting question, because I think in America there is a lot more illustration on Broadway shows than there is in the UK on the West End. I quite often see when a show transfers from America to England, the poster is reimagined in a more photographic format. For example, if you think about the original Wicked poster, that was a kind of vector graphic. And then when De Winters took it on in London, they did a more sort of photographic version of it. I don't see that changing. I think that the more photographic style is the trend at the moment here. I think illustration has its place for some things, and definitely for sort of children's shows. And yeah, sometimes for musicals and things, but I can't see us going like Broadway, where a lot of things are illustrated, because it's just not the trend. But who knows what will become fashionable? I don't know. Nick also asks, do you listen to music whilst you're working? If so, what do you listen to? I listen to a lot of musical theatre. It's sometimes I listen to all the shows that I'm working on, obviously, but also I've got a few of my favourite musicals. Just listen to them over and over again. Not very cool. What else have I got? Rhiannon Morris has asked, what mistakes do you often see made on theatre posters? Are there anything you suggest people should avoid? That's a good question. I think the main mistake is if your poster makes the show look like it might be boring. That's just the worst thing, because no one's going to want to see something that's boring. If it looks like it might be boring, then you need to change it. I think one thing that some people do is they think about it too literally. So I actually had I was talking to someone the other day who was doing a show, and she was saying that for most of the show, there is a girl sitting on a chair in a black box studio, and that's what most of the show is. And she said, so I think the poster should be a girl on a chair in a black background. And I think that is too literal and potentially a bit boring. I think it would be better to look for a metaphor that sort of sums up the spirit of the play, or somehow some of the themes, and have a bit more of a metaphorical approach rather than overly literal. Having said that, literal approaches can be quite good. If what's literally on stage is pretty awesome. So for example, Fishbowl, which was one of my Edinburgh posters that I did last year, Fishbowl, the set was basically this entire block of flat. There was 3 different block flats that were actually constructed sort of in the set on top of it. It was an amazing set, and everyone was sort of doing things in their own rooms. And when I saw the sort of drawings of the set, I just thought, that's just awesome. I would want to see that show. So I basically just recreated a sort of simpler version of what the set was going to be like for the poster. But I wouldn't normally recommend doing that unless it's going to be awesome. So I hope that, I'm trying to think if there's any other mistakes people make. I think sometimes if you're trying to do something on a budget and you're working with a designer who's maybe quite new to the industry, I think overcomplicating things is a bad idea. I think it would be I think it's better to keep it simpler if you can, especially if you're working with someone who's sort of a bit new to it all. Try not to, I think sometimes you see something with like loads of different textures and loads of different fonts, and you actually just think if they'd found one really nice font and just done something really clean, that would have been better. So that's another mistake, maybe. Let me have a look for some other questions. What are your thoughts on changing the key artwork halfway through a campaign if the initial design doesn't seem to be landing? I think if you've not got the original design right, then I guess I don't know if I've come across that happening. I'd be interested to see an example of that happening. Like with the Amelie one, I think it's okay to introduce new ideas and to have a sort of secondary poster just to spice things up a bit. I don't know about completely losing what you had before, because I think there needs to be some kind of brand continuity. Maybe you keep the title treatment the same and it just feels like a continuation, something like that. Have I got any other questions? Sorry, I have to scroll through it on Instagram, so it's a bit difficult to see the questions. I think that's everything. Hang on. Oh, this is a good question from Chris. What differences do you find between designing for big West End theatres versus tiny fringe theatres? So I think, in a way, there shouldn't be that much difference, because you should be selling the show and you should have faith in the show that you're selling. But I think there is a difference in the audiences that go. I think to some extent you should bear in mind your target audience. But I think there can be problems with that as well, which I'll go into it in a minute. I suppose if you're doing a West End show, it needs to feel iconic and it needs to feel big. Whereas if you're doing a Fringe show, you can afford to be a bit more arty. Your audiences are maybe going to be more kind of people that go and see a lot of Fringe theatre rather than tourists and people that go once a year. So you can afford to be a bit more kind of kooky and unusual. So I quite like doing Fringe stuff because you can be a bit more kind of, bit more creative in a kind of alternative way. I guess maybe you don't have to do the obvious. Maybe with West End shows, you sort of need to do the obvious image, whereas with Fringe, you can go a bit off the wall and get something that's a bit more intriguing. I think one thing that is a bit of a sort of bugbear of mine is when people talk about going on tour and going to regional venues, and they sort of think that people in regional venues are more stupid than people in London. I don't live in London, and I'm not more stupid than people in London. So I don't like this idea that you have to sort of play down to the people in the regions and make it simpler for them. I don't think people who aren't in London like floating headshots in shiny boxes any more than people in London do. I was working on a show last year or maybe the year before, and it was quite a sort of biting dark comedy, and it was that the producers wanted to sell it as a sort of more light-hearted sort of farcical comedy, just because they felt like the people in the regions would relate to that more. But the trouble was that didn't really go with the show. It also didn't go with the writer, who always writes kind of dark comedies. And we ended up with a poster that you sort of look at and think, I don't really know what that is. So I think if you've picked a show for a venue, then hopefully you've already thought about, well, the people that come to this venue want to see this short sort of show. You've got to believe in what you're selling and sell that, I think. I've got another question from Ashley Cook here saying, what are your thoughts on using production photographs on posters? I think it's okay later on in the campaign. I don't know if I'd use it as a main. I don't think I'd use it as a main poster unless there is just a moment that is just awesome. And there's the couple of times that I have done that, it's usually been with physical theatre. There's a company called Theatre Ray who I work for, who sort of trained at Lecoq, and it's all very sort of physical theatre, beautiful stuff. And I like using production shots on their posters because there are these just beautiful moments, and you can find one moment that sort of sums everything up. But I don't know how much it really gives a show sort of its own identity. I think it's fine as a sort of later follow-up thing, but I think I'd be wary about using a production shot as your sort of main image. I've got another question here from Harry Neal, who says, when starting on a new project, what art styles, genres, or artists inspire you the most when coming up with initial ideas? So I think it depends on the show. So if the show is set in the 60s, then I'm going to have a look at some 60s art and that sort of thing to try and get some inspiration of the sort of typography and colours and shapes they used. Also, I think if there's, and this isn't really genres or artists, but if there's a very specific look to the show itself, if there's maybe already a designer on board and they've got this very firm idea of the aesthetic that they want to go for, then hopefully you can be inspired by those ideas to try and get a poster that feels like it's going to match with the look and feel of the show itself. Yeah, so it really depends. It really depends on the show, and it has to come from the script, really. There was an interesting poster done. I didn't do it, but it was done whilst I was at De Winter's for a show called Prick Up Your Ears, which was about Joe Orton and his partner. And Joe Orton's partner was a collage artist. And the poster was a used collage. And I think that's quite interesting. If there's something in the show that hints at a certain type of art, then it's quite fun to get that involved. But obviously that's not very often the case. Let me see if I've got any other questions. I think that might be everything. Hang on. Yeah, I think that's everything. If anybody has any other questions, please just type them in now. But I think we're done. Hang on. Just the last thing I just wanted to say was that a lot of my work is collaborative. there's a lot of, I don't think anything is completely done by me. I collaborate obviously with my clients, the theatre producers, because we discuss ideas. They give me feedback. We bounce things around together. There's some producers who I just love working with because we just kind of bounce off each other, and the ideas get better as we share it with each other. The other people I collaborate with are photographers. So obviously I sometimes do my own photography, but that's usually when it's still life. I also collaborate with Michael Worley, Nick Rutter, the other Richards, Davenport and Lakos, Darren Bell, Bronwyn Sharp, Bob Workman. There's a lot of them, and they're all great. So thank you to those people. And yeah, without having that sort of conversation and collaboration, it would be pretty difficult to come up with a good poster. Also marketing agencies. It can really help having a marketing agency kind of helping things along, especially if you're a new producer and you're not quite sure how things work. I can advise what looks good, but marketing agencies can really help sort of target those ideas and just sort of tell you what works. So I work with JHI Marketing, aka Emma Martin, who has her own marketing company, Beth Nichols, who is the same, Chloe Nelkin, I Am, and various others. And the other people who are really important is the other theatre poster designers, who I very rarely get to collaborate with, but there's a nice community, and people sort of support each other and like each other's work, and it's nice to be a part of. So if you're interested in designers, you should look up Steph Pine, Matt Smith from Desk Tidy Design, Sean and Mark from Muse Creative Communications, Alison Collentine and John Noakes, who are my old colleagues from De Winters and who've now gone freelance. They're all lovely, and I feel very sort of proud to be part of this kind of slightly niche little community. I think that's everything. Yeah, I'm going to say goodbye. Guys, tune in tomorrow to hear John Britton talking about Pillowman. It should be really good.